if we put our values front and center and we let those be our guiding light, that be the compass that directs us to make decisions, make choices, act in our lives, we can't go wrong. But when we forget our values, when we compromise our values and allow our choices to be made with those values in the background, that's when all of the problems begin.
Welcome to Veteran Led. I'm your host, John Barry. Today's guest is Kevin Miller, the founder of No Power, No Responsibility. And he has an accompanying book and another book coming out this spring. Welcome to the show, Kevin.
Thank you, John. I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's an honor to have you here. For many of us officers that had to go through Command General Staff College or ILE, had to take that pain, you were behind the pain. Tell us a little bit about that position in the military where you got to direct some of that training.
Well, so John, I understand you went through the most painful variation of CGSC, as we love our acronyms and our abbreviations, right? Because you were doing it remote, and back when we couldn't do Zoom meetings, we couldn't do virtual classes. So while obviously the pandemic pushed us to that at one point, the best way to do that, the whole point of Command and General Staff course is to make leaders who can work in a collaborative environment, who can problem solve, it's a critical thinking course. And so when I started out as an instructor, and worked through the point of it eventually becoming the director of instruction for half the country, the courses that were run on the reserve side, I taught it as a critical thinking course. So everything that we did, I tried to push the instructors, I tried to push myself to draw out from the students that skill set that you have to think critically. And it's really difficult because to think critically, you have to set aside your biases. You have to know your biases, and then you have to be able to acknowledge and account for them when you are going through the problem-solving process. And that's one of those things that is very difficult because our biases are so locked in. They're like bad habits that are ingrained inside of us. And so that is something that, in fact, that's reflected in all of my books and my organization. It's all about getting people to be effective critical thinkers. But for me as a instructor and eventually a director of instruction, it was one of the most rewarding things in my entire life, let alone my military career, because the impact that I could have on up and coming leaders and watching them progress through their careers and seeing them move on to higher ranks and higher levels of responsibility. So just a phenomenal experience. And another thing that I was just honored and blessed to be able to do.
I thought it was a great course. It sucked because I was a practicing lawyer. I remember 2 to 3 times a week, we'd get on these remote calls for classes. Then we had projects and homework in between. But you're right, we really learned how to work as a staff. And so a lot of times what would happen is the project would be due the next day. And so we would have some guy who was actually an active duty soldier, just came back from deployment, did not have time to go to ILA or CGSC. So he ended up, we would send the slide deck to him that he would format. Like he was the format. He was the lowest ranking guy, but also because he was on West Coast time, we could send it to him at the end of the day, and it was only the afternoon. So I remember that, and I remember also getting hit with that operations course afterwards that some of us had to take in addition to ILA to be eligible for promotion to lieutenant colonel. And I got to tell you, I hated that class, but I love what I got from it in terms of learning how to better visualize the battlefield, really understanding operations and explaining the vision of how you want things to move forward. That was one of the greatest gifts I got. This is a painful gift because doing the class after hours and coordinating with people, this was before Zoom. It was very difficult, but I made a lot of great friends, learned how to work with peers, and you're right, learned how to think critically. We all had our own biases, our own ways of doing things coming from different organizations, different staff specialties such as logistics, right, or intel, or we had a veterinarian, and all you come together and you have to create a plan and incorporate everyone's knowledge. And I will tell you that the gift of that was, as I have built out my staff at Barry Law, one of the challenges was like everything seems siloed in that if it was let's say it's an IT issue. well, only IT was solving it, right? Where in fact, it was affecting sales, marketing, operations, like everybody's affected. And yet just one person is trying to solve the problem. And that's, the one thing I learned in ILE is like, no, it doesn't matter whether you're the logistics person and it's a logistics operation. Everyone contributes. We're all problem solvers and we use the military decision-making process or whatever. But I really found value in that. And so thank you for teaching that class, even though I badmouthed you every day.
You're more than welcome. And yeah, AOC, that is that a lot of people would say that, so that's the advanced operations course. And when that came into being, people were told, by the way, you're not done with Command General Staff College until you've also completed AOC. It's like, wait, what? Yeah, it's like, where was the fine print? I don't remember seeing that in my contract that I signed. But it is, and I think the course has actually improved over time because it now it's an MDMP course. So it's very focused on getting all these groups of students. And in fact, when we created our ILE CGSOC classes, one of the things we tried to do was we went through all of the branches of the students and we tried to make sure every individual cohort of students had a mix of branches in it. So you'd have logistics, you'd have combat arms, you'd have the service and support, because you had to have that so people understood why it was so important to have everyone involved. So like you said, it even you see it reflected in your current business, your civilian business. And I was going to say the fact that you did all that through collaborative phone calls maybe laid the groundwork for your podcast today.
Well, it definitely did for my remote team. I'll tell you that. You learn how to lead remote when you have to work with peers remote. But I want to now talk about, you've got over 30 years of military experience, and yet you've been able to parlay that into your next position, your book, your organization. So tell us about that. Tell us about the book, the organization, and what you pulled from your military experience to build this.
Absolutely. Well, what's really interesting, so I spent most of my time in the National Guard and Army Reserve, 37 and a half years. But I started out enlisted for 9 years, went to OCS, got my commission, and eventually retired as a colonel. And when I got in for money for college. Like so many other people, it's like it was a means to another end. It was not, I never saw a lifetime career. But eventually I saw the rewards of the service and I said, okay, I'm going to stick around until I don't enjoy it anymore. And lo and behold, I enjoyed it enough. They had to kick me out when I turned 60. And they said, sorry, you're too old now. So it's like, all right, so we'll move on. But on my civilian career, I was in K-12 education. So I worked in many different roles in the public education arena, from the local to the national level. And at a certain point, the military and the education started to kind of come together and coalesce in my head. And I started to realize that the problems we're facing in education are the same kind of problems we were always facing in the military. I mean, they're systemic problems. They're not the kind of things that you could just, oh, well, we just fix this and everything's going to be better. So I started to realize and so the book and organization, No Power, No Responsibility, but it's KNOW. So do you know the power you have? You understand the power that you have within yourself, and you understand the responsibility that goes with that power. And once I started to play around with how that all played together, I said, wait a minute. If we change the way we do education and we put kids in charge of their own education, which is to say they take ownership. So it's not just, we don't just put the inmates in charge of the asylum. It's a lot more than that. But if we could put our children and give them the power to be in charge of themselves and their education, they will take responsibility for it because they have pride. They have that desire to be effective when they know that they're in charge. And so that led to my first book on education reform, reinvention. But I also started to realize at a certain point that those same principles are what are going to save us as a nation from a lot of the chaos, a lot of the hatred, a lot of the divisiveness that has become so common, again, at the local up to the national level. And so the book I've got coming out in the spring, which is called Superhero Nation, is all about helping people live their best lives, giving them the tools to live their best lives, which, interestingly enough, a lot of the same things that I taught in Command and General Staff College. It's all about critical thinking, but it's also about understanding the power we have as individuals and then being responsible for that power and not. And this is one of the most important, in my mind, lessons that are contained in the book is we take responsibility for things we don't have power over, or we try to. So it's, I feel responsible for that. And it's stressful. It creates anxiety because we feel like, well, I'm responsible for something, but you're not, because you don't have power over. You can only be responsible for things over which you have power. So everything else you have to negotiate. So if you want me to do this, what am I going to get out of it? It could be a personal reward. It doesn't have to be financial. It doesn't have to be material, but there's negotiating and then there's personal power. And once we take back our personal power, then we become responsible for the things which we have power over, which includes how we treat people and how we respond to new and different situations. And underlying all of these things in both books, in these principles, are values. And so one of the most important things I learned in the Army was the Army values. And I live by those values today. And if we put our values front and center and we let those be our guiding light, that be the compass that directs us to make decisions, make choices, act in our lives, we can't go wrong. But when we forget our values, when we compromise our values and allow our choices to be made with those values in the background, that's when all of the problems begin. So that the organizations, the book that's coming out this spring are all about bringing those things together, helping individuals live their best lives by living their values, adopting the power, responsibility principles, and then doing that as part of a supportive community. Those communities then become stronger, and we as a nation will all benefit then from each of us living our best lives. It's a win-win situation that is going to benefit all of us.
Well, I like what you said in the beginning about, we worry and we have anxiety about things that we cannot control. Right. And it's always, and dealing with conflict, if someone is upset with you and they're going off on you, it's a reflection of them. It is not a reflection of you and their inability to control their emotions. That's not you. It's always like what you think of me is none of my business. How you feel about me is a reflection of you. And to the extent that I can control what I can control, great. But and I'm sure a lot of leaders have felt this, I always thought of myself as like, I'm never the victim, because if I'm the victim, I have no power, right? Whatever the circumstance or person is, they have power over me. So I'm not the victim. And then, I run into a scenario where it's like, okay, legitimately here, I am the victim, but like, I don't like that narrative. Like, I'm not comfortable with that narrative because it makes me feel powerless. So instead of saying, I'm the victim here, I look at what the other person did. I say, no, what did I do? I did all the things, right. And so I did, I did the things that I felt were morally right. I did the things, it took some courage. I'm very happy with my actions. I am not happy with the other person's actions or the outcome. But, so I look at it from the perspective of, well, I'm not going to allow myself to be a victim. This is, yes, I suppose it's very easy to say in this situation, I was the victim and someone else took advantage of something. But that being said, I can't control that. All I can control is my actions. And so instead of looking at the situation from feeling sorry for myself, feeling like, woe is me, I realized really quickly, no, I have to change the narrative to look at what I did. And I'm very happy with my actions, even though I'm disgusted with the results in somebody else's actions. And I think that is the key, because if you beat yourself down with things you can't control, your life will be miserable and you will be powerless.
Absolutely. And actually, a person I've gotten to know over the last couple of years through an organization that he started is Arnold Schwarzenegger. And one of the things he says, and so he repeats this on a regular basis, is if I see something that I know is wrong, and it's frustrating. And so I think, hey, somebody should do something about that. So I look at it, and if I can do something about it, I'll do it. But if I can't, I let it go, because otherwise it just becomes that baggage. It just becomes that stress and anxiety that I'm carrying around, and I have no control over it. So, and that's just, very simple way of looking at this whole philosophy is if there's a problem and I can fix it, or I can at least improve the situation, then go for it. That means I have some power and I have some responsibility. But if I don't, if it's out of my control, let it go and just move on to the next thing over which I do have power and control and do what I can there to make a difference.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting on this front is you're also involved with Veterans for All Voters, a great organization. One of my friends and heroes, Todd Connor, is very involved in this, and I think it's a great way to get veterans involved in politics. But the other side of the coin is, you don't want to be watching CNN all day long. You want to break from that news because there's things you can't control. And I can remember, I think it was Ronald Reagan who said, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And my response to that is, if you're not better off now than you were 4 years ago, it's your own damn fault. And I think if you're waiting for a politician to fix your life, to fix your situation, it's not going to happen. Now, can government make things better for us? Absolutely. But can government make things better for you? That's an individual responsibility.
Absolutely. In fact, so you stole a line that I repeat throughout the new book coming out, because I say our country is not going to be safe. It's not going to prosper. It's not going to live up to its potential because of anyone in elected office or because some rich person decided that they're going to use their wealth and power to do something. It's only going to get better if we as citizens each take our own responsibility for ourselves and our communities. And if we don't do that, then there's nothing else. In fact, if we do that, we become less reliant on people with power and wealth. We become less reliant on the government to take care of us. We say, hey, you know what? We can reduce our federal spending because we don't need all these programs because people are taking responsibility for themselves. Granted, there's a lot of people with a lot of challenges that they've got to overcome. But that's where community comes in, and we bond together so that we can address those problems collaboratively, cohesively. We help each other out. We put our values forward, and then we live those values, and we will make this a country that is always the envy of the world. And we don't have to worry about what's happening in Washington, D.C. or in Hollywood or any place else. We worry about our communities.
Yeah, and as you said in the beginning, right, what you have learned is how to think critically and how to teach others to think critically. And I think we all come into situations with different biases, different preconceived notions. And I think the great thing about the military is we're stripped of that pretty quick. When 16 guys get in the shower together with 4 bars of soap, you've got 5 minutes for everybody to shower. These are people you just met on the bus, and they come from all over the country, all different, races, all, religious beliefs. It doesn't origins. It doesn't matter, because you learn really quickly we need to cooperate to survive. And so all of a sudden we're open to learning and listening because we know we're all in this together. When the drill sergeant's screaming at us and we're all doing push-ups till our arms are about to fall off, it's like, wow, like we have to be a team here. And I've got to get over, if I don't like you, I got to figure out why I don't like you. And let's talk about it. And, as that develops, a lot of times in the military, you figure out, well, why don't I like this person? And sometimes it's, I'm jealous they're a better performer than me, or I don't like them because they're a low performer and they're dragging the team down. And it's just being able to reflect and think, okay, why do I feel this way? Why do I agree? Why do I disagree? And be willing to be vulnerable enough to have the conversation.
And vulnerability is so critical. And I love the fact. So if you read Brene Brown's book on vulnerability, and, a lot of people might say, well, what does she know? She's great. It's all theory. But in her book where she talks about vulnerability, who does she talk to learn important lessons about it? U.S. Special Forces military personnel. And it says, and what they told her was, when we work as a Special Forces team, we have to be vulnerable with each other because that's the only way for us to trust in each other. And we have to be able to have that vulnerability-based trust, which is a Patrick Lencioni term I love, because it's all about that I can be who I am. I can make choices. I can take risks. and fail. And I know that you will have my back. You will be there with me. And that's the only way to have a team that can do the kinds of missions that special forces teams do. But that is the same for all of us. We have to be able to, whether it's with your spouse or significant other, with your children, extended family, your neighbors, your community, your organization, whatever it happens to be, you have to get to a point where you're willing to be vulnerable. And once you get to that point, it's amazing how free you feel, because you're no longer always looking over your shoulder to wonder, oh, who's going to see this and say something about it? Who's going to criticize me? Who's going to not like me? Which you mentioned before, it's like, I can't do anything about what anybody else thinks, but I do want the people close to me to have faith and trust in me, to respect me. And that means I have to do the same for them. It's a two-way street. Yeah.
Yeah. And I find when we get, upset, right? We want to just lash out. We want to tell this person how wrong they are, and we want to just, burn them. But once again, that's where it's a reflection of us. And so I found that, where I've been disappointed or been upset, I want to go off on people. And I've done that, and it hasn't been too successful. And usually when you do that, you become the bad guy. And it's almost better to sit back with your thoughts. And usually, the best course of action is no course of action. And I've said this before, when I was a criminal defense lawyer, I would say, my clients, for various reasons, generally would understand that they had a right not to talk to law enforcement, and yet they would. And they'd always say, I understand I have the right to remain silent. I just don't have the ability to remain silent. And I think a lot of us have that same problem where, we know the best thing to do is to shut our mouths. And yet we want to launch into somebody, and it never does any good. And it usually harms us more than it harms the other person. So, it's one of those hard lessons learned where you feel it, you know how you're feeling, and you want to act on it. You feel this compelled to act, but you have to have the restraint to pull yourself back from, saying or doing something stupid. But that being said, I want to push this into, who is your ideal candidate, or who are the people that are involved in the no power, no responsibility, workshops? Who's reading your book, and what are they getting from it?
So I'll tell you first and foremost, I'm the world's worst self-promoter. So I'm great at, I'm great at being in leadership positions, in part because I never won. I've ended up in all kinds of leadership positions because I was the best person for the job at the time. And it's great, I'll jump in there, I'll do what needs to be done. But I've never been about blowing my own horn or talking about what I've already done. It's what am I going to do? And so when I wrote the book, my first book, No Power, No Responsibility, I had a lot of grand plans. And right as the book was getting published, I ended up going essentially on 2 years of orders with the Army. And so the book kind of went into the background, and I got doing other things. And that kind of led to getting interested in doing the new book. And I was doing other things as well. My career just took different paths. And so and that was a bit narrow focus. So it's still for anybody who wants to figure out, why do we have so many problems in schools? So the first thing I do in that book is I talk about, why do we have all these problems? Why do we have achievement gaps? Why do we have so many kids not performing well? Why was the pandemic so disastrous for academic achievement? All these kinds of things that we talk about. Why is absenteeism a problem? And I identify all those, but it all comes down to the same thing, which is kids are not in charge of themselves. So that means everything we do in a school is a negotiation. So the book talks about why we're where we are, how we got there, and now how do we move forward? How do we actually create a new education model that will be effective? So anyone who's got an interest in that book is for you. The second book, the new book, it's really for everybody. Now, when I started it, I was looking to figure out how to help veterans and service members, especially those who are struggling with mental health challenges, suicide, ideation, a lot of the challenges that we see coming out with veterans on a regular basis. Even though that's still a small percentage of the total number of veterans, those are the ones that need a lot of assistance. But what I figured out was the same things that will help them are the things that will help anyone live their best lives. And if you put it in that framework, because one other thing we know is as veterans, we don't like to ask for help. And sometimes we don't even want to accept help because we say, oh, that's a sign of weakness, which we all know it's not. And most of us who are in the roles that you and I have now, John, we recognize that. We know that asking for help is a sign of strength, but it's very difficult for a lot of people to do that. So by looking at, okay, if we frame this as how do we help every soldier, every sailor, every veteran live their best life and give them the tools to do that, it will also help them develop the resilience and the ability to overcome the challenges they're facing. And then I turn that into a book that's for everybody, but it has a lot of military lessons in it. And so it really is a self-help book, but it's also a leadership book, because if you adopt these principles, you will be a more effective, better leader of an organization. And nobody can live their best life in isolation. We have to have a community around us to live our best life. And so by being a part of a community, living our best life, we make the community stronger. Then that community starts to spread the message. Everyone starts to get stronger. Everyone becomes more resilient. People take back their personal power. They become less prone to manipulation. They become less a victim mentality, and now understand, what can I do to make my life better? What can I do to make my community better? When we do that and we spread that message, that's what's going to give us the strength as a nation to thrive for the next 250 years, to live out the vision that our founders had when they signed the Declaration of Independence. And to me, that is as important a work as anyone can be doing. So that's what the book is all about, that's coming out in the spring.
All right, let's go to the after action review. Your examples of great leadership and horrible leadership. You don't have to name names. Let's start with the great.
So the greatest leader that is burned into my memory was, and he passed away early in my career, but he was one of my instructors in platoon leader development course when I was an NCO. And he was one of my instructors when I went through the officer candidate school. He ended up being my company commander and mentor going through that. And he was one of the quietest, most thoughtful instructors and leaders, but he was so powerful in the messages he sent. One of them, I still remember to this day, he talked about how he said, you want to show respect for your country and your flag. How many of you walk past a flagpole every day and don't salute it because it's just become that flagpole it's just part of the background? He said, that our regulations in the Army say that when you're 6 paces from a flag, you present arms, and when you're 6 paces past, you order arms. And it's like those kinds of lessons just sank in. And then again, he passed away. It was actually a civilian job accident. But to this day, Major, he was posthumously promoted to Major from Captain, Vern Langhoff. I mean, so I don't mind sharing that name at all, because that was just phenomenal. And another great leader, much more recent, was 4-star General Brown. He was the USARPAC, U.S. Army Pacific Command commander. He came and he talked to our CGSOC class about mission command. And it was a class on critical thinking, MDMP, but he was also very vulnerable. He talked about the fact that as he's talking to us about mission command, he said, I've got 3-star generals in my command that don't get it. And I can't figure out how to get them to adopt this. They want to micromanage. They want to be, they've got this old school idea of leadership, he said. So again, it was setting an example of vulnerability, talking about challenges he's facing, while also talking about what is it that's going to make us successful in the future. Incredible stuff.
I have a story about that because I think he was the same guy that was in charge at Fort Leavenworth when I went through my battalion command school. So he was a 3-star then, and
that's where he started.
Yeah. So here's the story. So I was a new lieutenant. I arrived at Fort Hood, and we were going to deploy to Bosnia, but our sister battalion was going to deploy before us. So I link up with some guys I knew from the infantry officers basic course. I'm going to live at their house while they're deployed, and then I'm going to deploy. I'm just sleeping on their couch for the last 2 weeks that they're there. And Dan, one of my roommates, comes home. He's the platoon leader. His platoon sergeant, who was the range NCOIC, hadn't slept in a couple days, went outside the range fan, shot an Apache longbow that was, hot from, there was an Apache range right next to it. And there was a huge investigation, and he was the lieutenant. I remember him saying, my career is over. and what happened was, so he was called, I think in front of at the time, I think it was General Honorary, and then there was the 2-star, I think the division commander name might have been Burns. I can't remember. But as the story goes, the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Brown at the time then, said, look, this is on me. I am responsible. And, this is not about the lieutenant or the captain. They did their jobs. I am the battalion commander. This accident is on me. And so that was a hero moment with the troops because they saw him stand up and protect them. But also it was interesting because as General Brock told the story, he said, well, then when we did the RIP TOA and the new battalion came in, that's my battalion, the battalion commander said, man, you did such a great job here in Bosnia. It's too bad your career is over. And yet that battalion commander retired as, I believe, as a lieutenant colonel, whereas General Brown got 4 stars. So there's something to be said for, in the military, you can survive mistakes. When you make mistakes, own it and protect your team. Protect them in the way that, hey, it's on. Look, we might have all made mistakes. With negligence, protect them. Don't protect them if they do something willful, right? Mistakes of skill, that's okay. Mistakes of will are never okay, and we can never tolerate them. But that being said, so I know, great leader, and that was the backstory. So I knew when he was a battalion commander that he was going to be a great leader. And then there you go, makes it to 4 stars, despite having, what looked like a career-ending accident, early in his career. So let's go to the bad leadership.
So and unfortunately, there's enough of those to pull up too. So I'll bring up one because this one, lives were at stake, lives were lost. I commanded a police mentor team in Kunar province, Afghanistan, 2008 to 2009. And so first I'm going to do a shout out because the guy who was my deputy on that team in Kunar, in 2 weeks gets promoted to brigadier general in the Wisconsin National Guard. So I'm so proud, and I'm so glad he stuck around. He was a captain at that time, should have been a major, which was its own leadership problem. But he was phenomenal. But we worked with a gentleman by the name Captain Will Swenson. And we worked with the Afghan National Police. He worked with the Afghan Border Police. When we ripped out, he was still there. He still had, I don't know, maybe 6 months left on his deployment. And so a few months after we left, he ended up in a significant tick firefight in a little village called Ganjagal, which every day on our intel reports, Ganjagal would come up with threats, something bad going on. Well, Captain Swenson was there with his team, border police, but there was a mission being led by the Afghan National Army for a key leader engagement. And there's a lot been written on this. There's books that have been written. So Captain Swenson stayed back, was kind of in the back where all the vehicles were, and the other team went forward. And not surprisingly, they got ambushed. And I won't point fingers, but they weren't getting support. The person who probably should have been in charge of everything that was going on was not on the scene. And Captain Swenson's like, we got to do something. So one, he starts calling for indirect fire. Oh, they won't approve the indirect fire. And part of that was there was nobody, I think, above the rank of captain back in the TOC. So they were like, oh, we've got these rules of engagement. Can you see the enemy? Yeah, but are you like directly eyes on? Well, you get that kind of stuff going on. So he starts to go in and out of the battlefield, bringing people back. In first an U.S. Army armored vehicle, I can't remember if they had an MRAP or up armored Humvee. But then when that was no longer serviceable, they're jumping into Afghan's pickup trucks and driving in under fire to bring back wounded. And unfortunately, the Army mentor team that was with it was actually a group of Marines that was with the Afghan Army. All were killed. He pulled all of them out to recover their bodies. His NCOIC, Sergeant First Class Ken Westbrook, got shot in the neck, and he put him on a helicopter to get him out of there. Unfortunately, he also didn't survive. And when all was said and done, they eventually they got helicopter support that allowed them to at least withdraw without more losses. But in the end, Captain Swenson does his report, submits it, and of course, he's very honest about everything that happened, the lack of support, and he sends his after-action report. So if you're familiar with Dakota Myers, he was a Marine corporal who was there, who not in a relatively reasonable amount of time, he gets awarded the Medal of Honor. Same person who submitted for him submitted for Swenson, but Swenson's packet got lost 3 times, I believe, if memory serves me correctly. And of course, the conclusion that I would maybe draw is that he was critical of the leadership that was happening there. So eventually, though, he did get awarded the Medal of Honor. So it's just, there's leaders not taking responsibility. And a similar situation, I had to do an investigation of a unit that returned from Afghanistan. And when they returned, their leadership started to hear all kinds of reports of problems when they were in country. So I got assigned the investigation, and I did that. And when all was said and done, I pointed at the higher headquarters leadership because that unit should never have been deployed to begin with. But of course, the commander of that unit got fired, and other people got in trouble, but nothing happened despite my findings. It's like nothing else happened with that, and those are the kind of things, again, not taking ownership. That the example that you give of then Lieutenant Colonel Brown saying, "Hey, that was my responsibility." That's the kind of leadership that we need. We need people to accept when they are responsible, or sometimes even step up in this case and say, yeah, I wasn't there. I didn't make any of the direct decisions, but ultimately, those are my units. Those are the people that I'm responsible for. And so I will accept that on their behalf because that's what good leaders do.
Yeah, I found that if you really want to have values in your organization, core values, like you talked about the Army values, at Berry Law, we have core values. And what I found is, it's not just about giving an attaboy when people follow the core values or giving out awards for them or mentioning and recognize them publicly. It's about sometimes as a leader saying, hey, these are our core values, and this is the way we used one to make a tough decision, or in the alternative, this is a moment where we failed because we did not follow our core values. And, to call yourself out like that and say, as a leader, I made this mistake because I didn't follow this value, I think shows that, it prevents that, people going up, like as the packets getting lost, things happening because people are critical of the leadership, right? Because if the leadership doesn't know who's critical, or I should say, doesn't hear the criticisms, then they don't get the gift of feedback, and they can't improve. Now, that being said, I'm sure that you've probably been involved in what used to be the command climate surveys. And so I had 2 company commands and a battalion command. And so, the one thing I noticed about those surveys was a lot of it, might have had less to do with the leadership and more to do with, were we deployed at the time? Were we going into a deployment? Were we coming out of a deployment? A lot of it was, has the leadership been in place for a long time? Is there new leadership? And when you do a change of command, you'd see, you'd do those surveys. And it always struck me as, this is great data and great information, but you have to be cognizant of where the unit is. What have they been through, and what are they feeling right now? And if they distrust the leadership, then it's your fault, right? And you have to rebuild that trust. And I think I think it was General Dusty Schultz. You said, I think it was, results happen at the speed of trust. Like, if we don't trust our leaders to do the right thing, we're never going to get where we want to go.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Well, and so living your values is its own reward. It's amazing how good it feels when you know you've made choices for the right reasons. And you feel then that gives you that resilience. And it's even almost like a little shield of armor that, hey, if things don't turn out as well as we hoped, at least I know I made those choices for the right reasons with my values out front. But then the other thing is, we often don't know what the fallout will be of making poor choices. That unit that I did the investigation on, I think I interviewed 60 some enlisted soldiers. And some of them, you could just see the future leaders that were sitting there. I mean, these were people that it's like, man, these would be great lifelong soldiers for the Army. And yet almost every one of those soldiers that I interviewed couldn't wait to ETS and get out. And the reason was because they didn't want to be part of an organization where what they experienced in a combat theater was what they understood that unit and that the Army was. I was like, that cost us so much because a number of leaders in that chain of command didn't make values-based decisions. They made convenience-based decisions. They, took the easy decisions. So yeah, it's just, that's just so important.
Yeah, and I think, the other side of it, as a leader, I have noticed that the things that have propelled our organization the furthest, most of those decisions were not popular. None of them were unanimous. So that being said, Kevin Miller, where can our listeners learn more about No Power, No Responsibility, and your upcoming book?
So I have a website, and simply it's noresponsibility.com, but KNOW responsibility.com. And it's kind of an author site. It's got some stuff. When I wrote the first book, I put a lot of resources there for people that wanted to start doing education reform. So a lot of it's still based on that. But as the new book it's scheduled to come out in the spring. In fact, literally yesterday, I finished the first round of revisions on the 18 core chapters. So my editor is going to be moving it to the next level of editing. My publisher, I should say. So again, the name of the book is Superhero Nation. So you can look at that look for it next spring. I'll have more information coming out. And certainly when we get to MIC, the Military Influencers Conference again in the fall, I'll be there with the book talking about it and hopefully doing some sessions that share a lot of those same principles.
Outstanding. And for veterans that want to learn more about you and your journey, Kevin Miller, where can they find you?
So you can find me on LinkedIn. Reach out, say you saw me on John's show here on the podcast, and I'd be happy to link up with you, Kevin Miller. And of course, that's a fairly common name, so you may have to look for the one with the pretty head, not a pretty face, just a pretty head. Other than that, Instagram, I'm on Instagram as well. But as I said, I'm really bad self-promoter, so I don't do a lot of social media. That's one of those things that I'll have to change, because this is an important message to get out. So that's why I also really appreciate you having me on, John, here to talk about all of these ideas.
Well, it's an honor, and I wish you well with the launch. You know, the problem with writing one book is the second one has to be better. So I wish you the best of luck with that. And thank you so much for sharing your journey on Veteran Led.
You're welcome. Glad and really thrilled to be here. So thank you.
Thank you for joining us today on Veteran Led, where we seek to help veterans build an even bigger, better future after military service. Unfortunately, for some of our veterans, the roadblock to a better future is that they are not receiving all of the benefits that they earned. If you need help appealing a VA disability decision, contact Barry Law.